recap, the last 2 weeks we've heard from two libertarian economic speakers who have discussed additional models for ways of managing public lands. We talked through some models of privatization with Dr. Terry Anderson, and then last week we visited the idea of national public trust with Dr. Barrett. Our first two speakers gave us a good overview of environmental economics with some case studies. And so this week we're going to refocus some of our attention back on wilderness specifically and evaluation of wilderness through economic terms. Our speaker this evening is Dr. Richard Barrett. Dr. Barrett is Emeritus faculty here at the University of Montana in economics. He received his PhD from the University of Wisconsin. He is going to be our only speaker who is also a civic leader in our community. He's currently serving as a senator in Senate District 47 for our community of Missoula, and prior to that served from 2008 to 2012 as a Montana House of Representatives member. So in preparing for his talk tonight, Dr. Barrett provided me with a book chapter that he wrote about the economic considerations in scientific debates. It was part of a larger compilation of essays put together by Dr. Dane Scott, who's an ethics professor here that many of you may have had, and the book itself is called Debating Science. I'm going to post Dr. Barrett's chapter on the Moodle site for you because I do feel like it did a wonderful job of presenting some information that we've heard from some of our speakers, but with some, I thought, some really defining clarity that in some ways we haven't gotten from some of our speakers. And Dr. Barrett has mentioned he's going to talk through some of that tonight as part of his talk. He mentions in this chapter, he starts off with the phrase, economics explains everything. So, and where that comes from. And so we've heard that from a few of our speakers over the last several weeks. So I thought it's worth a topic at least exploring in the reading, and maybe Dr. Barrett will address it tonight. So I would just like to, with that, remind folks to turn in your papers at the end of class and pick up papers if you haven't picked them up yet, because we do have some that folks haven't picked up. And welcome Dr. Barrett to this evening's lecture.
She didn't tell you that I actually didn't say that I said everybody says that economics explains everything, but I didn't say that it really does. I said, I think I pointed out a lot of things that economics doesn't explain, like why the Earth warms if you put more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, stuff like that. There's all kinds of issues that economics doesn't explain, so the realm of economics is typically social rather than the physical world or whatever. So let me get started here. The topic for my lecture tonight is turning things on their head, how policymakers think about wilderness economics. I hope you found that title a little bit intriguing, the idea that I was going to see how policymakers turn things on their head. If that doesn't sound too good to you, that is, if it doesn't sound too good that policymakers are turning things on their head, your intuition is running in the right direction. I think I'm going to try and persuade you that policymakers don't necessarily think about the economics of wilderness or the economics of much of anything as they should. First of all, it would be presumptuous of me to characterize how all policymakers think about anything. So I will specify that the policymakers I am talking about here are those that are squarely in the political as opposed to bureaucratic or practitioners arena. So who I'm really talking about here is elected officials of all sorts, but particularly legislators who go, in other words, the 150 people, one of whom is me, who go to Helena for 90 days every 2 years and try to craft what they hope are good laws and good policies to guide the state until they can come back 2 years later. Okay. So it's those 150 legislators that I'm really thinking about, because those are the ones I know particularly well and think I understand how they think. So those are the folks I'm talking about, and like it or not, what they think is important, because they have real effects on events. They are people who do the turning of things on their head, referred to in the title of my talk. And what I'm going to argue here is that what they turn on their head is the conventional view within my profession, that is the economics profession, of what the economics of wilderness is all about. And not just the economics of wilderness. I suspect that it is the conventional view has been pretty much informed this lecture series. And I confess that as well as a trained economist, as well as a well-trained economist, I tend to be sympathetic with that view. So when I say that my policy-making colleagues in the legislature turn that view on its head, I am definitely not happy about it. It is, in a word, heresy. I should note as well that I have been complaining about this particular heresy for decades, at least to no discernible effect. Maybe I will have better luck with you tonight. I see Doug Dahlenberg, one of my colleagues in the audience here, and he can definitely attest to the fact that I have been complaining about this heresy for decades. So the way I'm going to do this is as follows. First, I'll lay out for you this thing I am calling the conventional view, and I think that's what you've heard about probably in the first 2 lectures in the series. And then describe its heretical inversion and the practical, political, and conceptual reasons why that inversion occurs and the consequences that it has. Let me alert you right now to the fact that I believe that wilderness is a particular case of a larger category of issues, having mainly to do with environmental and resource economics, and I will be drawing some examples from those other areas, climate change, for example. Let me also say that I assume that for policymakers, the relevant economic question about wilderness is one of resource management. That is, faced with the necessity of managing a cluster of resources, land, landscape, habitat, water, wildlife, recreational opportunity, ecological significance, and so forth, which can be, and this cluster of resources can be used in any number of ways. How should economics be brought to bear on that choice of how those resources are to be managed and used? Or another question, in considering how to manage wilderness, for example, in determining what kinds and how much recreational access is going to be allowed, again, how is economics going to be brought to bear in those internal management decisions? The conventional, indeed formulaic answer to this question is that economics should be employed to determine the highest and best, and that's in quotation marks, the highest and best use of the resources in question, where highest and best is defined as the one that produces the largest material benefits for humans net of cost. Okay? So the largest material benefit for humans net of cost. Costs here have a particular meaning as well, namely the benefits for humans the resources in question could provide in their next best use. This is an idea that economists use a lot, and you should be familiar with. It's the notion of opportunity cost. What really counts when we're trying to figure out what the cost of something is, whatever it may be, the cost of an automobile or the cost of a dinner or the cost of a hotel stay or whatever, the cost to that from a social point of view, not necessarily from the private point of view of the person who's providing this, selling this good, but from the social point of view, the cost is whatever else you don't get because you have to use your resources to do that thing. Okay? That's the notion of opportunity cost, or the foregone opportunity. And so when we talk about the highest and best use of resources, we're talking about producing something that the benefits of which are as high as possible compared to whatever else we could be producing with those same resources. That's the highest and best use, the one that produces the largest net benefits for humans. Remember that, for humans again. So, getting back here. We, economists, that is, often use the word utility instead of benefit. And it generally is taken to refer to how well off we are. When we say benefit or utility, it's how well off we are. We prefer more utility to less, all kinds of things, hot bread, getting married, being cured of an illness, confer utility. And here's an important thing that economists believe. We are capable, economists believe, of trading off things based on the utility that they provide. We can decide, for example, how many loaves of hot bread we would exchange for not getting married. Or turn it the other way around, maybe. How many loaves of bread would we be willing to sacrifice in order not to have to get married? Or how many would we take in order to, would we give up in order to be able to get married? Now, I mean, it sounds silly, doesn't it? That is, that the idea that trading bread, loaves of hot bread for marriage. And one would hope that there wouldn't be a quantity of hot bread sufficiently large to compensate you for being deprived of the opportunity to marry the person you're in love with. That's not the point. The point is, from an economics point of view, is always somewhere implicitly out there you're making those kinds of choices. Okay. Now, you don't very often get confronted with the choice of hot bread versus marriage. Okay. But you might get confronted with choice of hot bread versus shrimp salads. Okay. And you are capable of expressing some preferences between those based on the utility that it is that you're expecting to receive. So that's a fundamental underlying notion that in economics is that people, consumers, the buyers of goods and services in the economy are capable of making those kinds of trade-offs, okay? Based on the utility that the various things that they are purchasing confer. So, a simple example. Should we dam the Grand Canyon? And I will remind you that were it not for David Brower and the Sierra Club, the Grand Canyon would be dammed. They were going to dam it, okay? And Brower and the Sierra Club and others opposed it. Well, for economists, the choice of whether or not to dam the Grand Canyon comes down to this. What are the material benefits or utility to people of an undammed canyon outweigh the value of the electricity the dam could produce, the additional irrigation water made available, and perhaps the downstream flood damage the dam could prevent? From an economist's point of view, that seems like a perfectly reasonable comparison to make. There you have it, the Grand Canyon. Okay? And that's one thing you can have, or you can dam it, you won't have it anymore. And you can have all these other things that are not trivial. Okay? Those are not trivial things. I mean, those are things like flood control that keeps people from being drowned and farms from being washed away, irrigation water, electricity. You all use electricity, don't you? Okay. Those are all important things. And the economics, from the point of view of an economist, the economics of whether or not you should dam the Grand Canyon depend on the benefits conferred on people by an undammed canyon sitting there in all its incredible glory and beauty, okay? Those benefits compared to that electricity and all that. That's the opportunity cost to you of having the Grand Canyon is not having those things. Okay. So that's the way the economist characterizes the judgment that the public policy maker has to make if he wants to find, or she wants to find, the highest and best use of that ground in Arizona that the Grand Canyon is sitting on top of. Now, I know that this kind of economic calculation is not popular with a lot of people, including probably a lot of people in this room. I'll deal with that momentarily, but first a bit of terminology. The idea of seeking the highest and best use is also sometimes called optimizing the use of resources, or using resources efficiently. It's somewhat like fuel efficiency in your car, measured in miles per gallon, only we're measuring dollars of benefit per dollar of cost. In fact, calculating benefit cost ratios for alternative uses of resources is the way that policymakers operationalize finding the highest and best use. That is, if you really want to play this game seriously, to go back to the Grand Canyon question, you figure out some way of putting a dollar sign on that unspoiled Grand Canyon. I know you've heard a little bit about how you do that, and I know you all probably think, what nonsense? But that's what you have to do. And then the other part's easy. The electricity, well, we know how to put a value on electricity. Flood control, we can put a value on flood control. What was the other one? What? Irrigation? Yeah, irrigation. We can put a value on that. And so we're going to do a benefit-cost ratio. We're going to take these benefits over here, and we're going to take these costs over here. We're going to take the ratio of the two, and we like those numbers to be very big. Certainly greater than 1. Okay. You certainly want the benefits to outweigh the costs if you're going to do this thing. Notice that conceptually there's not much difference between a public policy maker applying benefit cost analysis and a private resource manager maximizing profit. Profit is the difference between what a business can sell its product for and what it costs to produce it. And conventionally, at any rate, economists believe that what people are willing to pay for a business's product is a measure of how much benefit they expect to receive when they consume it. So, willingness to pay is a measure of benefit. This leads economists to their touching faith in markets. Businesses maximizing profits will optimize the use of resources for society at large. When a farmer uses her resources to produce wheat rather than barley, because the wheat sells for more, she's giving people what they most want. Okay. There are all sorts of intellectual challenges we might make to that conclusion as well, but I don't think we have the time to consider them tonight. I will, however, recommend a recent book on the topic, Fishing for Fools, by the Nobel Prize-winning economists George Akerlof and Robert Shiller, which raise a very fundamental question about whether that story that we just told about the farmer is true or not. Okay. Is it really true that the farmer, when she decides to sell wheat instead of barley because wheat is more valuable, is optimizing the social use of resources? More to the point, or Akerlof and Schiller are saying, well, yeah, maybe in the case of the farmer, but in almost every other case, no. Because the farmer is not, that's not very real. That's not really the way the economy looks out there. The fly in the ointment for public resource managers, of course, is that while public resources can produce very real and substantial benefits for people, those benefits typically don't command a price. So tallying up the benefits for a benefit cost analysis can be a real problem. Again, that's the problem of how do we put a value on the benefits that an unspoiled Grand Canyon confer on us? Okay. This absence of price comes about because public resource managers are usually charged with producing public goods. Okay. Now, public resource managers and public goods mean different things. The use of the word public there means two different things. And the public resource managers are governmental resource managers, basically. But public goods means something very specific. Public goods are goods that cannot be charged for. Okay? Either because anyone can have access to them without payment. We call these goods non-excludable. Basically, the Grand Canyon here, the beauty of the Grand Canyon is available to you, and you cannot be denied access to that beauty on the basis you're willing to pay for it. Okay? It's just a practical impossibility to keep you from viewing the Grand Canyon unless you pay for it. The other thing about public goods is anyone can enjoy them without reducing the amount available for other people to enjoy at the same time. This feature of public goods is what we call non-rival. Okay, they're non-rival, meaning my use of them doesn't diminish your use of them. Okay? There's enough to go around for everybody, and when I consume a little bit more, you don't have to give up some. So that's the nature of public goods. For one example, which one of the early speakers in this series, John Duffield, did, he once calculated the dollar value to people of simply knowing that there are grizzly bears in the greater Yellowstone ecosystem. Simply knowing that. You think, well, how can that be valuable? Well, knowledge is valuable. Okay? Knowledge is surely valuable. We pay, you all, or most of you are here, paying to acquire knowledge. Obviously, knowledge is valuable. But it's obviously something that nobody can charge you for. If you know that there are grizzly bears in Yellowstone, okay, nobody can possibly charge you for that knowledge. And if I know it, I can tell you, and now we both know it, and it's not like a pizza, you know. If I give you my pizza, I don't have it anymore. Okay? But if I share with you the knowledge that there are grizzly bears in Yellowstone, okay, we both know it. Okay? And suppose I say, I think what I want to do is I'm going to charge people for this knowledge. So I'm going to, would you be willing to pay me for knowledge that there's grizzly bears in Yellowstone? And you say, whoops, no, you just let the cat out of the bag. Whoops, no, I can't, because now you know. Uh-oh. So I can't do it that way. So I say, would you be willing to charge me for some interesting information about Yellowstone, or pay me for some interesting information about Yellowstone? You say, and I say, I'd like $5, but she already knows. She's going to say, I'll give it to you for $4. I'll say, I'll give it to you for $3. He says, I'll give it to you for $2. She says, I'll give it to you for $1. Whoops, the price has gone to 0. Okay. So because the goods are non-rival and non-excludable, they don't have a price. Okay. They don't have a price, but we know they're worth something. And that's the problem with public goods. So Duffield, figures out a way to do this, and we'll get back to that in a bit. But for right now, let's go on with another aspect of the problem. I said that not everyone accepts the idea that public resources, or wilderness resources, should be managed to produce the highest possible net economic returns, the highest and best use, or the greatest benefit-cost ratio. There are several reasons why people get queasy about this kind of an idea. One is the belief that in general we value wilderness for reasons other than its ability to benefit us. Okay. And our reason for protecting wilderness has nothing to do with the benefits that we expect to receive from doing so. Okay. So there's probably a lot of people here in the room that say, you're kind of asking the wrong question here. I don't think we should protect wilderness because I materially benefit. We shouldn't protect wilderness in the same way we protect pizza parlors. I benefit from pizza parlors by eating pizza. I don't benefit from wilderness in that same kind of consumerist way. Okay. So we protect it not because it's in our best interest to do so, which is a decision which we could come to reverse if we saw our interests in a different light, but because there is a principle or a moral obligation requiring us to do so. Okay. The philosopher Mark Sagoff has argued that an example of this kind of thought in action is the Endangered Species Act, which requires the protection of endangered species as a matter of principle and not simply after a showing that the benefits to us of keeping a species around outweigh the cost. Okay. And that is in the Endangered Species Act. I mean, it's an imperative that's in the Endangered Species Act. There is a kind of an escape clause, but nevertheless, generally speaking, the decision to list a species as endangered or non-endangered and to protect it is independent of what we think its value to us might be versus the cost of doing so. So, of course, we know that a lot of people detest the ESA precisely because of that fact. Really? You're going to stop the construction of a shopping mall just to keep some bug or snail or cactus around? People respond. Sagoff takes this a little further. He says the fact that we protect species or wilderness as a matter of principle means that the conventional economic approach to wilderness management that I have been laying out here is, in a word, nonsense. Okay. Another way that people object to the application of economics to public resource management is to insist that it just can't be done. Okay. In part, this objection arises from the perception that while we do indeed benefit from wilderness, the benefits are subtle or qualitative or ineffable, and you just can't tack a dollar sign on that kind of stuff. Okay. My colleague, Tom Power, who you'll hear from later in this series, once wrote a whole book dedicated to refuting that argument. Okay. That is, refuting the argument that you can't put a dollar sign on those kinds of benefits. Or more appropriately, he wrote a whole book making the argument that those kinds of benefits are just as economic as any other kind of benefit. Okay. Just as economic as any other kind of benefit. The book was called The Economic Value of the Quality of Life. And what Tom argued in that book, and maybe he'll talk about this more when he's here, is that most of what we seek out every day, pay for, and value in markets is subtle, qualitative, and ineffable. Consider the clothes we wear, the way we decorate our homes, the resources we devote to making fancy food or buying it in fancy restaurants, the concerts we attend, and so forth. Tom's saying that, it's a false dichotomy between, say, food, potatoes, and you can think of potatoes as being, they're not concrete, but they're firm, real stuff. Okay, and you can trace their nutritional value and its impact on your health and so forth. And then to say, well, that's one kind of thing. And then there's the other kind of thing, which is some very fancy, nice potato dish. What Tom is saying is, in either case, you can't say this part is economic, the potatoes, but the subtle qualities of the potato dish and the pleasures, the subtle kinds of pleasures that we get from enjoying the potato dish are not economic. It's all just stuff that's good for us, that we like, that gives us utility. Okay? And those kinds of things, those kinds of subtle qualities, Tom is arguing, are what really we look for most of the time. Okay? We're way beyond, particularly in this society, we're way, way beyond having to sort of scrabble for our existence. Most of what we spend our money on, we could do without easily. Think about that. Most of what you spend your money on, you could do without easily. You could live a perfectly adequate and healthy life and spend 10% of what you're spending now. There's an awful lot that goes into our recreation and our entertainment and so forth. That is of that kind of ineffable character. Tom's project was to convince us that environmental values, and including that wilderness values, are just as economically real as the value of wheat or barley produced by our farmer. But unfortunately, I think that even he would admit that he has been beating his head against the wall as well, trying to make that point for several decades now and not made much progress. You can ask him about that when he's here. He'll shake his head ruefully, I'm sure. Some folks, well, a lot of folks, for some folks or a lot of folks, if it doesn't have commercial value, there just isn't, if there's no dollar sign attached to it, it just isn't worth anything economically. So we make the distinction between something being economically valuable and commercially valuable. Okay? Economically valuable means that it confers benefits on people. Commercially valuable means that it confers benefits on people, but it has a dollar sign that indicates how much benefit it confers. Despite these preconceptions, economists keep on trying to put price tags on public, environmental, and wilderness benefits. One approach they take, and I imagine John Duffield explained this to you, is to try and suss out how much people would be willing to pay for these benefits if they were required to do so. Okay. There are lots of ways to do that. How much expense are people willing to incur to get to a wilderness area? How much people pay in private markets to receive comparable benefits? By how much are healthcare costs reduced when some pollutant is controlled? And so forth. Or you can do what Duffield does and just ask people, how much would you be willing to pay for this? Now, there's a lot more to it than that. Okay? That area that John's research is actually kind of a pioneer in that research is called contingent valuation, and it's very complicated. And these people are going out there and they're measuring things like, what is the value to a person in New York of knowing that bears exist in Yellowstone in dollars and cents? Okay, in dollars and cents. You know, there's somebody in New York that on average the New Yorkers put 8 cents worth or 10 cents worth of value on knowing that there are bears in Yellowstone. 10 cents, we can ignore that. Whoa, wait, 8 million people think that. 8 million times 10 cents, we're talking real money here. Okay? That knowledge is worth a lot. Okay? So it's a very, and the procedure is controversial because people say, come on, Duffield, that can't be right. If you start multiplying this 10 cents by the 300 million people in the country, I mean, bears in Yellowstone are worth more than anything. There's something wrong with the calculation. But nevertheless, economists try and do it. Fools rush in where angels fear to tread. Another approach to pricing wilderness benefits is to privatize and sell them. This is what Professor Anderson recommended to you recently. His argument is that recreation in wilderness areas isn't priceless. It's just that we haven't bothered to put a price on it. But we could. And indeed, when it's practicable, we do. The fee for example, any wilderness river floater now pays a user fee. Okay. The trouble with this approach, however, is it only works for those wilderness benefits that are essentially private rather than public in nature. They are rival and they are excludable. When you decide that you're going to float the Maine salmon through the Frank Church Wilderness, you're going to you're doing that. First of all, you can be excluded. Okay? Go to Corn Creek and start to put your raft in the water, and they don't, and you haven't paid for your recreation fee. They'll take you out of the water and fine you, take your boat away, and you're done. Okay? And to a degree, it's rival because the experience that you want when you're floating the Maine Salmon River is a wilderness experience in any event. And so there's an issue of solitude. You don't want to be, this is not supposed to be Coney Island. Okay, this is supposed to be a wilderness experience, and so to many people, it is rival. By your consumption of the experience of floating the river, you're diminishing, if not eliminating, the pleasure that somebody else gets in floating the river. So in that case, those particular kinds of values are both rival and excludable, and they can be charged for. But there's no way at all you can think of those kinds of things as, yes, susceptible to having their value determined by actually marketing them. But there's no way at all there's no way to require me to pay for the satisfaction I derive from knowing that right now there's probably a grizzly bear feeding beside McBride Inlet in Glacier Bay in Alaska. That's the same grizzly bear that walked through my camp last summer. Actually, he's probably not out eating yet, but I like to think of that bear out there on a tidal flat about 50 yards from my tent, eating mussels and clams. Okay. Or that a humpback whale is now making her way back to Glacier Bay from Hawaii and will find a protected place when she gets there. You can't make me pay for having the satisfaction of that knowledge. Okay. So Professor Anderson's solution only works for a narrow range of wilderness values, it seems to me. Even supposing that economists can provide policymakers with meaningful measures of economic value of public goods and services, including wilderness, there is another problem that looms very, very, very large in the thinking of policymakers. And that is this. And this almost gets ignored by economists, and that's this. Even though the efficient management of public resources produces net economic gains for society, it almost always produces as well a set of winners and Economists have no way of weighing gains and losses against each other. That is, if you're the winner and you're the loser, you win to the tune of $100 and you lose to the tune of $100 or $120. We don't have any way of balancing those things out. They're 100 and they're 120, but maybe 120 means a lot more to her than 100 to you. Remember that stuff, that utility stuff? That's what we're all searching for, that satisfaction that we get. Well, it's ultimately subjective. Okay? We don't tell you what gives you utility. You show us what gives you utility by the way you spend your money. She doesn't tell us what gives her utility or deprives her of utility. She shows us by the way she spends her money. And there's no way of comparing the two. If something's going on inside your head, and this is the way economists think about it. Something's going on inside your head here that's creating these preferences and desires and utilities and so forth. And it's coming out in the way you spend your money, but there's no way that we can kind of measure inside your head and measure inside her head and see whether your losses outweigh her gains. It's ultimately subjective, which is a big weakness in economic thinking. Or is it, I don't call it a weakness, call it a limitation. Where am I? So, economists generally console themselves with the thought that improved efficiency should give the winners enough, okay, so that they can compensate the losers and still come out ahead. Okay. Compensation principle is important in economics. It's the idea that if the winners can compensate the losers, then hey, that's a pretty good deal. But this notion, as ingenious or facile as it may sound, generally falls on deaf ears among policymakers. That's because whatever policy might be proposed, no matter how efficient, the losers are going to get a lot more vocal and forceful in their opposition than the winners are in their support. Okay. Take, for example, the proposal arising under the doctrine of the public trust to maintain minimum in-stream flows in Montana's rivers in order to protect fisheries. Okay. You can bet your bottom dollar that irrigators who figure the proposal means they will have to let their crops dry up and their stock go thirsty are going to be in Helena pounding on desks. Okay. But are the anglers going to turn out in the same number? Okay. Are they going to be willing to pay fees so that irrigators can be compensated for their losses? Okay. Will Trout Unlimited be able to outmaneuver the Montana grain growers and the Montana stock growers and the Montana Farm Bureau? Won't happen. Will the trout themselves come up to Helena? No. Okay. So that asymmetry between the influence of losers and the influence of winners, which is always there, often because the losses that the losers experience are concentrated on a relatively small number of parties, and the gains are available to a very large number of people, but a little bit for each person. So that, for example, again, in the case of the maintaining in-stream flow in Montana's rivers, the irrigators can immediately identify the impact on them if they're not going to get their water. And they're going to be upset about that impact. They're going to feel a large loss. And that's going to motivate them in their opposition. On the other hand, all of the trout fishermen that might possibly benefit from maintaining in-stream flow in a particular stream, there may be lots and lots of them, lots more than the irrigators. Well, there may be hundreds of anglers for every irrigator, but the benefit that they're going to get is relatively small. So are they going to be willing to go up to Helena for that, to try and secure that benefit? No. So there's a kind of an asymmetry that goes on there, and that asymmetry, that tendency of the losers to outweigh the winners in these kinds of in this kind of decision making means that there is a bias against efficient policies. Okay. There's a bias against action, and there's a bias against efficient policies because of that. And despite the fact that economists talk about this ability to compensate the losers, it just doesn't happen. Okay. Given these kinds of political pressures and their misgivings about the attempts any economists to put a price on public benefits, how do policymakers, particularly policymakers in political positions, make resource management decisions? Here's where we're getting to turning it on the head. Well, in my experience, they do not really engage in benefit cost analysis. What they fall back on instead is economic impact analysis. That is, when confronted with alternative strategies for managing resources, they gravitate towards the strategy that has the largest impact on local economic activity, as that is measured by sales of businesses, incomes earned, population growth, taxes collected, and above all, by jobs. Okay. That is, publicly owned resources, including wilderness resources, have economic value measured by their ability to generate economic activity in general and employment in particular. Okay. There are lots of examples of this kind of thinking. When it comes to wilderness, advocates frequently find themselves trying to appeal to policymakers by citing the jobs that will be available to outfitters and guides, or to the jobs that will be created when tourists come to the state and eat at restaurants or sleep in motels, or to the jobs of the folks behind the counter selling backpacking gear and fishing rods and boots and so forth that people going into the wilderness are going to need. When it comes to issues other than wilderness, the policymakers' focus on economic impacts can get pretty stunning. Since the EPA announced the Clean Power Plan, for example, Senator Steve Daines has consistently characterized it as the Obama administration's war on coal, okay, which is going to put coal mines out of business and coal miners out of their jobs. But so far as I know, and I follow this discourse pretty closely, he has never once acknowledged that the purpose of the plan is to arrest climate change, or that arresting climate change will produce benefits for people all over the world, or that economic value of those benefits might very well outweigh whatever costs the plan imposes on us. Indeed, the EPA presented calculations demonstrating that those positive net benefits of the plan will be forthcoming. But no, for Senator Daines, in short, jobs are good, and that is true independent of whatever is being produced in those jobs, even if it's a climate catastrophe. Okay. I have to say, in connection of this kind of public discussion about the Clean Power Plan and about climate policy, that advocates for the Clean Power Plan that work, for example, in the solar or the wind or alternative energy fields, make the same argument. It always shocks me to hear an advocate for solar or for wind come and say, we need the Clean Power Plan because it'll create lots of good jobs. Okay. They're supposed to say, we need the Clean Power Plan because it'll stop climate change. Okay. And it'll secure the benefits of arrested climate change, which are huge. I mean, they're worth billions and billions and billions of dollars. But yet we have these two sides in this debate carrying on this conversation about the Clean Power Plan, where what they talk about is what's going to create more jobs. Okay? They're talking about which strategy is going to be most expensive. That's what they're talking about. We're turning things on their head, and my title comes in, because what economic impact analysis does is invert benefit cost ratio, the benefit cost calculation. It says, in effect, that best and highest use of resources is the one that creates the most jobs. That is, rather than maximizing net benefit derived from public resources, it maximizes their costs. Jobs are costs. okay? Not benefits. Now, you should be looking at me and saying, is this guy completely out of his mind? Because you hear it all the time, don't you? That the benefits from such and such are jobs. You hear that jobs argument made all the time, and here's a guy standing up here and telling you, jobs are costs, not benefits. Okay. But, and in the context of cost-benefit analysis, where would the jobs go? Where would the wages paid for jobs go? They'd go in the denominator, in the cost part, in the denominator, not in the numerator. Does that sound ridiculous? Well, consider again our farmer. Remember our farmer? She was the one who quite properly used her resources to produce wheat rather than barley because her customers valued it more. Does anyone seriously think that a better way for her to decide between wheat and barley is to grow the one that takes the most work? No. Well, that's in effect what happens when policymakers opt for the use of public resources because it maximizes employment. Okay. Now, okay. I need to back off a little bit here. Implicit in my argument is that jobs are costs is the assumption that the workers occupying the jobs could always be doing something else. Okay. That means that when we put them to work making X, we are sacrificing Y that they could produce in some other employment. But when there is unemployment, when the economy is in recession, putting people to work is possibly socially costless. If they weren't making X, they wouldn't be making anything. Okay. But there still is a private cost, of course. People have to be paid. Okay, so if you put unemployed people to work from the private point of view, they have to be paid, and so that's a cost. But socially, if they were otherwise going to be unemployed, it's costless to hire them. We give up nothing to hire them. But the bigger point is this: even if we are determined to put people to work, all jobs are not equal. What people do when they work still makes a difference. We can always put people to work digging holes in the ground and filling them up again, but that is not costless. Certainly there is some better use of their time and energy. And that's something to think about when you think about unemployment in general. If you have this image in your mind that there's a pool of people out there who are never going to work unless we give them a job in a particular application, and you know that there are unemployed people out there, there's millions of them, okay. It's not correct to think of those people as unemployed forever, or we give them a job. In fact, people are constantly moving in and out of employment, in and out of the unemployment pool. And so when we hire somebody, even if there's unemployment going on, and even if that person was unemployed when we hired them, we're still depriving somebody else or some other line of activity from the work of that person. So even in a situation with unemployment, jobs are not costless. But I do need to point out that there are some kinds of local economic impacts that are meaningful in assessing the value of public goods. That is, they are impacts that measure benefits rather than costs. Economists, for example, have studied the impact of proximity to wilderness areas on local property values and wages. If people are willing to pay more for a house because it is near a trailhead to the Selway Bitterroot Wilderness, or if they are willing to take lower wages to live in the community where that house is located, that tells us something about the value they place on wilderness or the sacrifices they are willing to make in order to get it. It can happen as well that wilderness can have local impacts that enhance the productivity of local resources. As when, for example, the protection of a watershed means that water for irrigation will be more reliably available, or downstream communities can enjoy safe drinking water without having to shoulder high treatment costs. So, but be careful about this. Now think about it going back to the idea of, say, you have a wilderness area and that provides jobs for outfitters, fishing guides and so forth. Now we say, well, look, because this wilderness area is here, this thing is going on. Okay. And it's true that the wilderness area is creating value in that activity. But you don't want to measure that by the jobs. Okay? You don't want to measure that by the cost of the activity that's going on. You want to measure it by the contribution that the wilderness area makes to the net value of that activity. If the wilderness area means that by creating a protected fishery and so forth, if the wilderness area means that now that activity is more productive, it's more valuable, then yes, the wilderness area has made a contribution. And in that case, think of it more like infrastructure. Okay? It's like the way roads enhance the productivity of businesses, or public utilities enhance the productivity of businesses. Wilderness can have those kinds of local impacts, and there are meaningful measures of the value of wilderness. But it is the addition to valuable goods and services that the wilderness makes that reflects the value of that activity, not the cost, other costs associated with developing it. So it's a somewhat subtle distinction to make. Okay? We say, yeah, the wilderness area, by making this fishing guiding business possible, is producing benefits. Okay? That's true, but the benefits are not in the amount of cost that the local business incurs. It's in the net value of the output that the local business produces that is attributable to the existence of the wilderness area, that is a measure, the appropriate measure of what the wilderness area is actually doing. So it can happen that wilderness can have local impacts. Okay, so the problem with economic impact analysis is that it treats costs as though they were benefits. But is that so bad? Is it really a bad thing to manage resources so that people will have jobs? Okay. I mean, I've been saying here, oh, look, this is all wrong. Okay. You shouldn't manage public resources or wilderness resources in order to generate jobs for people, even though everybody says that that's what we should do. But why shouldn't we? I mean, what's wrong with that? What's wrong with managing for jobs? Well, consider the movement to take over, for the states to take over federal land, okay, which recently burst out in the Occupation Wildlife Refuge. Movement activists will tell you that they want to improve the economic productivity of the land. Okay. And in the case of Malheur, that translates into more cows and fewer sandhill cranes. Okay. Because what these folks mean by economic productivity is that the land will support more commercial activity, more logging and more mining, and the jobs that go with it. But there is no assurance that the activity will be productive. No guarantee that it will be viable without subsidized access to the resources it needs to survive. The subsidies can get pretty big. Clive and Bundy, you remember Clive and Bundy? Clive and Bundy is the guy who started all this. Well, actually, the federal land takeover movement is decades old. But Clive and Bundy was the one that got the current round going when he thought that he should be able to graze his cattle on federal land for free. That's a pretty big subsidy. Okay. Why on earth would anybody in their right mind give away federal land to somebody to grow cows on it if that person can't possibly operate at a profit? If the person says, I want this land for free because otherwise I can't ranch, that's tantamount to saying is, I have a very low productivity, not very worthwhile economic activity that I'd like to engage in, and it's the only way that I can possibly do it is by you giving me this land for free. Okay. And that's, I think, much of what lies behind this movement for taking over federal land. By taking over the movement and by taking over the land and saying, now it's going to be available to anybody who wants to exploit it commercially, what we're saying is we're not moving resources to their highest and best use. we're moving them to their lowest and worst use. Okay? We're going to be using them for activities that are demonstrably not viable. Low productivity activities that can only get along if they get a huge subsidy in the form of free access. If you haven't done so already, you should read Ed Abbey's essay called "The Cowboy and His Cow" on this topic of federal land and cattle on federal land. He gave that speech at a less than sympathetic audience at this university in 1985. Famously put a 6-gun on the table because what he was going to say he figured would be so unpopular that he thought he ought to make his position clear ahead of time. The impulses of the China takeover movement are not hard to understand. If adherents feel they are struggling to survive, it's again that winners and losers problem. It explains why jobs have such salience for public policymakers. People carve out a life for themselves. Think about the Bundys or some of those other folks at Malheur. People carve out a life and a job for themselves, and they are going to hold on to them fiercely. And I believe it works politically to the disadvantage of wilderness and environmental advocates. When we focus on jobs rather than on the real value of wilderness or of environmental quality, we are co-opted. And in the political arena, as often as not, we stand to lose. Consider again the Clean Power Plan. Supporters of the Clean Power Plan can certainly claim that it will foster jobs building wind farms and retrofitting buildings and installing solar panels. But if that's the argument, they'll probably lose, because the people who are going to get those jobs won't show up in Helena to testify to the plan, but 300 angry coal miners are guaranteed to show up against it. And they bring those great big huge pieces of machinery and park them outside the Capitol and everything. It's quite a dramatic sight. I have one other significant reservation about using economic impact analysis to manage the use of public resources. That is, the economic analysis, impact analysis, is almost always wrong. There are lots of reasons why that is true, but the fundamental problem is this. When we say, for example, that some areas as wilderness will create lots of jobs, what we are typically talking about is creating a demand for economic activity in the surrounding area. Okay. Now you hear a lot, so that's like, if we have hunters, then we'll have hunters coming and staying in motels and eating in restaurants and probably going to bars too. And so we're creating the demand for economic activity in the local area, and that's what's considered to be the benefit of the wilderness area, that kind of demand for local, in the local area. Now you hear a lot of this kind of talk when the media tell you that economic growth is being driven by consumer spending, rather than, but of course demand and spending themselves are not productive. Rather, they create an opportunity for productive activity to be profitably undertaken. And the problem is that whatever process leads to demand to rise in one place often means it falls in somewhere else. Okay? When people visit the Swan Valley on their way to hike in the Missions or the Bob Marshall, sure, that is good for the Swan Valley. More stuff gets sold and more work gets done. But if those tourists are from Billings and are spending their money in Sealy rather than at home, less stuff gets sold and less work gets done in Yellowstone County. Fairly typically, I believe, economic impact analysis fails to account for the whack-a-mole nature of demand. It adds up the gains and ignores the losses, and in the process overstates the impact of whatever it is we are talking about. How much is this overstatement? A number of years ago, when I was writing a paper on economic impact analysis, I ran across an article by a professor of sports management at Texas A&M. The article was a catalog of some 11 reasons why the economic impact of sports stadiums is usually overstated. As an aside, private developers of stadiums typically seek public subsidies based on the impact facilities will have on local economic growth. I didn't quite understand some point or other in the article, so I called the guy to ask about it. He didn't want to spend much time on my question, and so he cut to the chase. Listen, he said, I've read hundreds of these impact analyses, And I've come to the conclusion that they're off by an order of magnitude. You take whatever they say is the impact, divide by 10, and that'll be about right. Okay. I thought that couldn't be correct, but as I carefully picked apart more and more of these studies and corrected for their obvious errors, it turned out the guy was right. I could have saved myself a lot of trouble just by dividing by 10 at the get-go. I will close then by saying you will undoubtedly run into many instances in which the value of wilderness is defined by its impact on the level of surrounding ancillary activity. I have tried to explain why I think that approach is seriously deficient, not to say dead wrong, but I know you will be tempted to employ it anyway. Often it's the only game in town. But if you do, all I'm going to say is divide by 10. Questions? Two things happen when nobody asks questions. Either I've been completely clear and there's just nothing to question, or people say, I don't have any idea what to ask him because I didn't get a word of it. Any questions? Yeah. Well, okay, thank you.
In terms of the legislation, in terms of the politics, are there debates over the economics, or is it just lining up the sides and counting the votes?
When I say that this is the way that policymakers think of the economics of wilderness, they're not. I don't know that they're really thinking economically as much as they're thinking politically. It's very interesting. You have, take for example these consensus processes. For example, in the rattlesnake, the consensus process for determining how to, what kind of logging to engage in the rattlesnake. You're bringing together people that represent jobs, people that represent recreation, people that represent all kinds of different interests in the problem. And what do we call them? We call them stakeholders. Okay. So the consensus process, even though it is in a sense an economic process, and it is in a sense intended to provide some kind of, if not optimal, at least acceptable practice, hopelessly confounds costs and benefits. Because what it boils down to is trying to reconcile interests, not trying to calculate benefits and costs. That's what what policymakers are backed into, that position of having to reconcile competing interests. Anything else? Yeah.
At the risk of asking for an equation, I'm still trying to wrap my head around the idea that adding jobs to a result is a cost and not a benefit. I don't think I can tell somebody else how that works. Can you?
Okay.
Again, when Steve Dane says you're going to get so many jobs out of my policy and your policy will cost jobs,
well,
therefore mine has more benefits.
What we're trying to do with say in the Clean Power Plan, what we're trying to do is to figure out the lowest cost way of producing electric power that meets some kind of emission standard. Okay? Clean Power Plan specifically calls for controlling the total level of emissions in the state of Montana. Okay? And so the question is, how are we going to generate electricity and control emissions to that degree? Okay? My answer would be to say, what we should do is find the lowest cost way of doing that. Okay? And the lowest cost way of doing that might be, well, it's not necessarily going to be the one that produces the smallest number of jobs. But since jobs are a big issue in the cost, what we're looking for is a way of meeting the Clean Power Plan that, that minimizes the cost of producing electricity and while meeting those standards. If, on the other hand, so now we have some choices. Okay? We have, maybe we could sequester carbon in a coal-fired power plant. Very expensive. Okay? Or maybe we could have more rooftop solar, or maybe we could have more conservation, or maybe we could have more wind, or whatever. Okay? When we're trying to figure out what's the least cost way of generating electricity under that cap of emissions, what we're going to be doing in calculating that least cost method is we're going to find out how much cost is each one of these different ways of doing it going to incur, including how many dollars worth of wages are they going to pay, and how many jobs are there going to be, and how much wages are they going to pay. And we're going to look for the one that has the least cost, not the one that has the highest cost. So if, for example, if Senator Daines or the coal industry says, you know, the problem with this plan is that it gets rid of jobs in the coal industry, the right answer might be to say, good. Again, this is from the economic point of view. I mean, if you live in Colstrip, it's another story entirely. Okay, and that's the winners and losers problem, and you know, it's a huge problem. I don't want to minimize that. It's a huge problem, but if what Senator Daines is saying is that the best way to meet these standards is if in meeting these standards we're going to get rid of a lot of high-paying coal jobs, you should say, well, that sounds pretty good, because that means that you've got some lower cost way of doing it. Okay.
To change your terms, Senator Tester says adding more wilderness adds more jobs. That is a benefit.
Right.
But if I followed you, adding more jobs is a cost, not a benefit, and that's where I'm losing the.
Right. Okay. Senator Tester says, yeah, adding more wilderness will add more jobs.
More fishing guides, and more outfitters, and more gas sales.
Exactly. What an economist would say is the correct benefit cost calculation for adding more wilderness is what is the value of additional wilderness, the kinds of benefits that wilderness confers through habitat preservation, recreational opportunity, all of those kinds of wilderness values we might think of, and compare that to the cost. So what's the appropriate comparison? Do you want to compare, let's say you have a candidate study area, and you're going to trying to decide whether you want to use it for wilderness, or do you want to use it for cutting trees? Okay. How do you want to do the benefit cost ratios? In each case, you're going to take, in the case of the trees, you're going to take the value of the timber, you're going to subtract the wages, okay, because they're a cost. Okay. In the case of leaving it as wilderness, you're going to take the values of the wilderness plus the value of the recreational, of this fishing guides or whatever. You're going to subtract the cost of the jobs. Okay. The jobs are a cost in that kind of benefit cost analysis. Where it becomes a problem, obviously, is for example, in the case of the public land transfer movement, where you are saying we're going to use these resources, which obviously have other things we could be doing with them. Okay? We're going to use these resources to subsidize an activity that can't survive. It's not that under current conditions, these folks can't survive. They can't continue to operate. The net value of their private economic activity is too low. Their job costs are too high. The value of what they're producing is too low. And the only way that we can keep them afloat is by giving them free access to federal land. That's an obvious case where, but where we're saying, no, bad use of resources. There's no point in subsidizing an activity that will collapse if we didn't subsidize it, okay? Unless you think that it's a good thing for this cost to be incurred, regardless of what it's being incurred for, okay? If you think it's a good thing for this cost to be incurred because people will have jobs, okay? But don't make no mistake about it, in terms of determining the net economic value of what's going on there, the jobs are costs, not benefits. An interesting, totally outside the realm of wilderness application of this was one, back in 2 years ago in the gubernatorial campaign in the Republican primary, there was a candidate who was responding to the notion that they were going to stand down some nuclear missiles and change the military mission of Malmstrom Air Force Base. Okay? And this guy, and they were doing it presumably for a variety of national defense reasons, national, military purposes. And this guy opposed it because it would mean fewer jobs in Great Falls. In fact, he said the loss of even one job is unacceptable. That's an example of somebody saying that one job is such a tremendous benefit to society, rather than being a cost, actually, because that one person could go and do something else. That one job, is worth more than perhaps reducing the risk of nuclear annihilation. I mean, it's crazy talk. We shouldn't be using resources to subsidize the incurring of cost. We should be using resources, if anything, to create net benefits, but not simply to create cost without knowing what the purpose of that cost is. Yeah.
Right, then, to follow up with something else.
Go ahead.
Your military analogy I really love, because you can almost use them interchangeably with a military strategy and its local costs, like if we change our nuclear plan and that means Malmstrom becomes obsolete, we argue about that. Or if we want a wilderness area and that means the logging industry can no longer function, and we argue about that.
I think the military analogy is important because one thing that it is extraordinarily difficult to do in the United States is to realign military missions or to change the time and place mission of various kinds of military facilities. Because everybody in Congress, if you have a military base in your district, the most important thing to you is that that military base stay there and spend money. And it doesn't make any difference to you what it means for military policy or national security or the possibility of avoiding a military conflict, as long as you spend the money in your district.
And what it seems to illustrate there is what was brought up earlier, is economics in this case just Marquis of Queensberry rules about how we're going to fight, when what it really comes down to is, do I have more votes than you?
Well, I think
more force to bring to bear, and we'll settle this by the least violent means available.
I don't know that anybody is necessarily pretending that economic policy, that military policy is economic in character. I think probably if you look at the military planners in the Pentagon and places like that, yeah, they do bring some economic considerations to bear. They may say, look, we can do the same thing for less money. Or for the same money, we can do something different here. But for the congressman from the district where the less money is going to be spent, It doesn't make any difference. The only thing that matters is the politics. Okay? I mean, and I think that's why, you know, local economic impacts are what interest to the political policymakers. And it's very interesting if you go back to the case of the Clean Power Plan. You can, a few pages in to the Clean Power Plan, you can find the place where they add up the economic value of improved health and a number of other features, another significant benefits coming from controlling emissions. Okay? And they sit there and they say, here's how much better health is worth. We save this much in the way of doctor bills. We save this much in the way of avoided sick days. We save, you know, go on and on. That's even just a drop in the bucket, because obviously being healthy is, you're probably willing to pay more for being healthy than what you actually have to pay when you go to the doctor. So, they calculate all that and they say, look, it's worth more than what it's going to cost. Okay? That's a true benefit cost analysis. And yet this discussion about the thing goes, and the costs are how much resources do you have to use to produce the power, okay, that we're going to use while controlling the emissions. I mean, that's a true benefit cost analysis. It comes back down to Montana, to the coal-rich producing state. And what do we argue about? We argue about the amount of jobs in coal versus the amount of jobs in wind energy or rooftop solar or whatever it may be. Argue about, oh, I got more jobs than you got. No, we got more jobs than you got. We're arguing about who wants to incur the most cost in order to get to this solution, and nobody talks at all about what the thing is worth, the benefits. Or they say, well, sometimes they'll say, well, those benefits are going to be received all over the world. Okay? And the effect for the whole world is so small that it doesn't make any difference. Again, that's a problem of when you count up however many billion people in the world are, even if the benefit is only 10 cents a person, it comes out to a lot of money.
I have just maybe one wrap-up question.
Okay.
We have about a minute left. So thinking in terms of the title of your talk of turning things on their head, I mean, I feel like your conversation about the contemporary conservation movement and how the focus by so many national NGOs is on job creation, wilderness public lands, and how many jobs they're going to create, to the point where, you know, the Wilderness Society has people on the ground completely focused on that, and many other organizations. Where is the conversation that you're talking about happening? Are there papers that are being written? Are there magazine articles, things I could direct students to look at this alternative idea that we shouldn't be focusing on jobs as the topic of conversation in conservation? Because that is, like, for a lot of these students who are working with those organizations, those are where most of the conversations are taking place. You know, I want you to go work in Lincoln as an advocate and talk about how many jobs are going to be generated by including Helena National Forest and the Crown of the Continental.
Well, yeah.
It's very tangential.
I mean, if that's what, you know, I don't think it's those conservation organizations and NGOs that have structured this conversation. I think they're simply responding to the political realities. And anybody who wants to go to Lincoln, what in Lincoln?
Just but one of the conversations that I've been a part of is how many jobs are going to be generated at certain levels of protection for places.
Okay, right. Well, you know, I think when you go to, I mean, if you go to Helena to talk to the legislators, and you say, Well, you know, an economist at the University of Montana figured out that the value of solitude and leisure on the Blackfoot River is worth $17.50 per user day. And so by preventing the development in this area, if there were a lot more people in the area and if it was developed, that value would go from $17.50 to $12.33. And so, you know, it's just, we'd lose too much in the way of benefit for the cost. The legislator's going to look at you like, what? No, those aren't believable numbers, you know. And besides which, you came from Missoula and you came to tell me in Helena that the value of solitude on the Blackfoot River is worth $17.50 a day. But I'm from Lincoln, and the people that vote for me are afraid of losing their jobs. Or the people in the Lambkins of Lincoln restaurant, you know, want more people coming in here and developing the area because they're going to sell more food. So those kinds of arguments are going to have a lot of a political appeal. So I don't think you can throw them out necessarily. But on the other hand, you can't expect, but I mean, and they may work, and may be appropriate in some circumstances, but just remember that when you go to Helena and you make that argument, you're making the argument of Senator Fields for taking over federal land and managing it to maximize the amount of commercial activity in the state of Pennsylvania, which is not good. Okay?
Great, thank you.